Welcome to season 11 of the Parenting Aces podcast, proud members of the Tennis Channel Podcast Network. I am your host, Lisa Stone, and this week we are talking college recruiting, and I am thrilled to have with us a PhD candidate, Katie Lever, who is the proud author of a new novel about college sports called Surviving the Second Tier. Please check the show notes on parentingaces.com for a link on how you can purchase Katie's book, and also for links on how to follow her on social media. After listening to this episode, you are definitely going to want to follow Katie Lever. We are speaking about the intricacies of college recruiting, the realities of college recruiting, some of the questions that parents and athletes and junior coaches need to be asking during the recruiting process. And also, we're going to talk with Katie about her experience as a collegiate athlete at Western Kentucky University. So I know sometimes you hear PhD and your eyes glaze over, but please understand, Katie is a fabulous speaker. The interview was super interesting, and I'm thrilled to be able to bring that to you this week. For those of you watching the video version of this episode, I want to apologize for the poor lighting. I have been relegated to the outer spaces to record this week, but I hope you will enjoy the information that Katie shares. And just quickly, before we jump in, a reminder, if you haven't done so already, we'd love for you to become a premium member of parentingaces.com. Just go to our website, click on the join button in the top right, and reap all the benefits of being part of our fabulous tennis parenting community. All right, for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy my conversation with Katie Lever. Katie Lever, thank you so much for joining us on the Parenting Aces podcast. I'm really excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Lisa.
So, as I mentioned, you have a new novel, your first. Congratulations on that, by the way. I hear it's like having your first baby, though I don't know because I've never written a book, but I think it's amazing that you had the determination and the willpower to sit down and churn out an entire book. It's just unreal, all while studying for your PhD, right?
Correct, yes.
Oh, superwoman. So I want you to tell the Parenting Aces audience a little bit about your experience as a collegiate athlete, and maybe to back up a little bit, your experience going through the recruiting process and how you made the decision of where to compete and how that experience led you to where you are now. So I know that's a lot, but
yeah, no, thank you for that. And it's funny you mentioned writing a book being like having a baby. I've never had a baby, but I think it's probably kind of similar.
yeah.
It is one of those processes that's very long and you do have to stick with it. But you know, my book was born out of my experiences as a college athlete. I ran track and cross country for Western Kentucky University from 2012 to 2015. I had a redshirt season that I used in grad school. And it's a mid-major university in Southern Kentucky. It's a moderately sized mid-major, so like we did have some influence from D1 schools in our state, like Kentucky and U of L, and we had that sort of competitiveness within our athletic department and our AD trying to get football and men's basketball really competitive and really putting all those eggs in that basket. And so I got a good insight to the college sports industry just based on my experience as a college athlete. And I tell people when they ask me about my experiences, I tell them that I had a bit of a mixed bag because I had some of the best moments of my life on my college team and also some of the worst moments of my life. When I first started running at WKU, I had a really difficult time adjusting to just the work-life balance demands of college athletes. And something that I tell prospective athletes in all seriousness when they're asking about those demands is that your sport in college will become a job. It is something that requires at least 20 to 40 hours of time throughout your week. You'll be having to sacrifice social like socializing, parties and things like that at times. You also might have to, or you might feel rushed or like you're having to cut corners in your academics. If you ever feel that pressure, don't give into it, because it's very easy to say like, oh, I'll take a B on this paper, or, C's get degrees. And that's true, but you should never sacrifice your academics for your sport. And that was something that I did, or that I didn't do when I first got into college. And as a result, my performances really suffered as a freshman. And so the first really negative experience that I had in college sports was when a coach pulled me aside after our conference meet in the spring. And she told me, Katie, if you don't shape up next year, then I'm going to pull your scholarship. And so we hear these horror stories and we hear things like that happen. And it's very easy when it hasn't happened to you to sort of brush it aside and say like, oh, this is just anecdotal. This doesn't really happen, but it does. Your coach will more than likely view you as somebody who has a job to do on the team, regardless of your sport. This is very universal. And if you don't fulfill that job, then you will essentially get fired. The only problem is, college athletes aren't employees, so we don't get other workplace rights, but we do get the negative aspect of that.
Can I interrupt you 1 second?
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
you just said that you don't advise sacrificing academics for the sport. Can you dig a little deeper into why you say that?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, that degree is going to get you farther than any athletic performances will, because more than likely as a college athlete, you will not go pro. Under 2% of all college athletes play professionally, regardless of their sport. And so you really need to focus on getting that degree in college, because that is what you are there for. Coaches can make this difficult when they do things like, threaten to pull scholarships if you don't do well athletically. But at the end of the day, the most important thing that you can do as a college athlete is focus on that degree and get that degree and give everything to it, because if you're an athlete who is thinking about going into grad school, you need to have good grades. It's not just enough to have the degree. You want to be competitive in the application process as well. And being an athlete will help you there, because hopefully whoever is reading your application will say, oh, this person played a sport while they were in college. So they have great time management skills. They're organized, they're disciplined. There are all kinds of positives that come with being a college athlete. But you also have to make sure that you remember that your primary purpose is to get that degree and to get it well.
It's student athlete, not athlete student, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it feels like athlete student a lot of the time. Yeah.
For sure. And so, okay, so I interrupted your story and I'm really sorry about that, but I think it's important for people to understand what this commitment is. It all sounds so exciting and so glamorous, and you think you're going to step foot on campus and you're going to immediately have this identity as a student athlete at that school, which is all true. However, there is the behind the scenes stuff that often is left out of the conversation when it comes to playing a sport in college. And that's exactly why I was so excited to have you on today, Katie, because I know you can talk to that behind the scenes stuff. And I think it's crucial that athletes understand it, that the parents of the athletes understand it, and really that the junior coaches out there understand it as well, because even though they may have played college tennis themselves, things are different now than they were even 5 years ago, certainly 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And the big reason that I wrote my book was because I wanted to pull that curtain back and teach people about the things that go on behind the scenes that might not be super apparent. And I want to do it in a way that was more engaging than just throwing like facts and statistics at people, because I've learned as someone who does research, and this is so frustrating to me, but you can tell people like, oh, here's a statistic about gaps in scholarships between men and women, like Title IX doesn't adequately cover that, or here are some testimonies about athlete abuse, that directly coming from the athletes. And for whatever reason, those facts and those statistics sometimes do not stick. And so I thought, okay, like what if I tell people a story? What if I get them emotionally invested in college athletes? What if I humanize college athletes a bit? Because it's so easy to view athletes in terms of their production. That's what happened to me when I was a college athlete too, because, after I had that horrible freshman year, I had a new coach, and I improved my times tremendously my sophomore year. I had a great year. I achieved goals that I never thought that I would. But then I started getting injured. And that was the first time I'd ever felt dehumanized as a college athlete. It was after I got injured, because my coach's attitudes about me just completely flipped. Instead of being praised and being viewed holistically as a person and feeling very loved on my team, I was just viewed in terms of what I wasn't doing for the team.
You were a drain at that point.
Yeah, I was dead weight essentially. Exactly. And it was just this horrible feeling of abandonment. And I remember my coaches would try to get me to train through injuries. And I mean, I was at the point where I physically could not train. It was very, very, and I have a high pain tolerance, but it was incredibly painful. And I still have hip issues from my experiences in college and training through those injuries. But I remember my coaches, they would try to get me to train through these injuries by telling me things like, oh, you're being selfish by not training. You signed up to support the team and you're not supporting the team right now. Or they would point to my teammate and say, she has a grade 3 hamstring tear and she's still training. What's your excuse? And so I felt like I was being lazy. I felt like I was being selfish. I felt absolutely horrible about myself, because my coaches were essentially gaslighting me into thinking that I was a bad athlete and that I was a bad teammate. And so, I write about that a lot in my book, because I don't want to paint, especially, on your podcast. I know you have a lot of coaches listening, and I'm sure a lot of very good coaches. And I want to emphasize that not all coaches are bad. I had some very good coaches in college, and we don't talk about the good experiences enough. But I also had some very bad experiences. And it's important, I think, especially for prospective athletes, to get that holistic picture and to make sure that they're navigating the recruiting process well, that they're informed and educated and asking the right questions and taking all of these variables into account, because the NCAA doesn't ensure any of that transparency in the recruiting process. And it can feel a bit like a charade or like an act or like a game that these universities are playing to try to hook these recruits without being fully honest. And so I always, like, my big job with my book and my research and my freelancing is to make sure that people at the very least have a better idea of what they're truly signing up for, because they might have a great experience in the NCAA. And I very much hope that for athletes, because I think that there is tremendous benefit to playing college sports, and there's tremendous promise for the industry that's not being fulfilled. But it's still important to talk about the reasons why the industry is falling short and failing athletes in the process.
Can I ask you, Katie, what your recruiting process was like? How did you make the decision to go to Western Kentucky, and what did the coaches say to you to make you feel like that was the right decision for you personally?
Yeah, I had a very positive recruiting experience. And part of the reason is because I'm a third generation college athlete. My grandpa played football for WKU. My mom ran for WKU, and my dad shot rifle at the Citadel. And so you mentioned it being a very different college sports industry now than it was even 5 years ago. And that's definitely true of the generational gaps between me and my parents and my grandparents. But we at least sort of knew what the demands would be like. And we knew, we had an idea of what we were getting into. We didn't, looking back on it now, it's like, ooh, there was a lot that we didn't know, and a lot that I should have asked, and a lot that I should have known going into this. But I would say that we were generally pretty well educated, and we at least knew what the experience would possibly be like. So we had some general idea. And so because of that, I knew to make sure that, coaches were showing me how the university would support me academically. So we checked out those facilities. We looked at different course schedules and calendars and things like that, degree requirements. And so it was nice just at least knowing that, I'm here to get a degree. these are things that are going to help me get that degree. We looked at, different things like tutoring resources and things that were available to athletes. And we really liked that about WKU because they had those resources available. At the time, I wanted to be a broadcasting major. I ended up in communication studies, and it worked out well. But WKU had a really excellent broadcasting program. So like just having that game plan was super, super helpful. And I wish the NCAA would do more to equip prospective athletes with that knowledge, because it makes all the difference when you know what you're doing going into the recruiting process.
Absolutely. Listen, that's the majority of the work that I do here at Parenting Aces is helping families understand what questions to ask and why they need to ask those questions. Because at the end of the day, the coach's job is to recruit new number ones as often as possible for their team, and also to sell prospective student athletes on the school and the athletic program. That's it. That's their job. There are very few college coaches, regardless of the sport, that are there to help the athlete develop further in their sport. Because for so many, as you said, the percentage of college athletes that go pro across all sports is so minuscule that I think a lot of these college coaches don't see their job as helping these players further develop in their sport. It's more to get them signed on and to win. And they are tasked with winning. Don't be fooled. It doesn't matter which division it is. The coach's job is to win.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it puts coaches in a very difficult situation
Absolutely.
as well, because as much as we talk about just the difficulties that athletes have navigating the NCAA, I mean, the coaches are in the middle of a really unsavory system themselves. I mean, I've talked to coaches, to my coaches after I graduated, because a lot of them follow my work and my critiques about things like scholarship policies, and they've told me stories. They're like, Katie, we were in these scholarship meetings where we had to allocate certain percentages of our budget to different athletes. And it was not human what we were doing. It's like we were putting price tags on you guys, and it sucked. And I was like, yeah, I mean, that had to have been an awful experience for them too. So, I do have, I don't know if I want to call it sympathy necessarily for coaches, but I have this level of understanding and empathy.
Sure.
Like, yeah, you're in a horrible system too. And we need to change this because it's not benefiting most coaches. It makes athletes vulnerable in a variety of different areas due to power imbalances and resource scarcity, and just a lack of protections that college athletes have. And so in a lot of ways, the college sports industry really only benefits those at the very, very top, while, the other 98% are put in very vulnerable situations and have to navigate a really just an unsavory system that's not designed to benefit them.
I want to get back to telling the story of athletes and their experiences. And again, getting back to your book, there seems to be a disconnect between hearing these stories and thinking, well, that was that person. That's never going to happen to me or to my child.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to that? Because it is one of my biggest frustrations as I'm talking to families and trying to help them, understand the best way to approach college recruiting and the best way to make their decision on schools. And it makes me really sad to think that there are these stories out there, but families are ignoring that and thinking that'll never happen to me.
Yeah, and honestly, I understand that reflex.
Of
As a
course.
parent, you don't want to say like, "Oh, I'm signing my child up to be manipulated or to be chronically injured or to be abused in any way." Like, you obviously don't want to go into the recruiting process thinking that, because there has to be. I think about this a lot. If I ever have kids, I'm like, do I want them to play college sports knowing what I know? And I don't have an answer to that. Like, I don't know what I would do in that position, because on one hand, if if you do well in the NCAA, you can get a lot of your education paid for, you get incredible travel and training opportunities. It really is a once in a lifetime opportunity to be a college athlete. But then if you get any of those negative repercussions attached to it, it really does have lasting damage that can be done. And so, the best approach, at least in my mind, is realism. Understand that your child, if they're in high school, they're about to be of age, they're about to make a lot of really important life decisions, without with or without your involvement, depending on how attached they are to you and your finances and everything else that you provide for them. The decision to be a college athlete is a very complicated one, but it's just one of those decisions that the athlete does have to make for themselves. Parents should absolutely be involved in that, because there are a lot of ways that athletes can be manipulated in the recruiting process. But realism is the best way to approach it, because this is just one of those many decisions that your athlete is going to have to make. And it's almost, I hate to say it, but it's kind of a coin toss, whether or not they are going to have a positive experience. There are things that you can do to try to prevent that. And going into the recruiting process with eyes wide open, weighing your options and asking the tough questions is definitely a way to prevent that from happening. But I think that parents would be doing a bigger disservice to their kids by saying, like, oh, this is never going to happen, so I don't have to worry about it.
True. And, listen, we both know, and most of my listeners know and understand, coaches leave programs all the time. There is a term called the coaching carousel. And, so that tells you that this is a common occurrence that happens typically during the summer. Your child may have gone through a year, 2 years, 3 years of recruiting with a specific coach, made a decision to play for a specific school based on their relationship with that coach. And lo and behold, the summer before freshman year, that coach leaves and goes elsewhere or retires or whatever. And all of a sudden you're on campus with a coach you have no knowledge of, no relationship with, no history with, and you're left to fend for yourself. And there is nothing you can do about it save transferring. And so, even if you plan really well and do everything right and check all the boxes during the recruiting process, there are still things that can happen between the time you sign that national letter of intent, or in the case of D3, make the commitment to go to that school and step foot on campus. And this is why, we always talk about the broken leg test. If on the first day of college, I get injured and I can't play my sport, is this school still a place I want to be and can afford to be?
Yeah. And that honestly is a really great mindset to have. It's funny you mentioned the coaching carousel, because I was a college athlete for 5 years and I had 4 coaches in that time span. I wish there were more statistics on coach turnover in college sports. I'm unaware of any. But just, from my experiences alone, we probably had about at least close to a dozen coaches come and go, just because with track you have multiple events and multiple coaches coming and going. But we had just massive amounts of turnover, and that's especially common, I think, in the mid majors. Because and I write about this in my book too, because a lot of coaches, rightly so, they'll view the mid majors as a stepping stone to the Power Fives, because that's how the industry is set up. I don't necessarily like that that's the reality, but from a career standpoint, it makes sense to, go to a mid major, stay there for a few years, establish a reputation, and then continue to climb that ladder for better job security as a coach. And
better salary, let's be real.
Yeah, Oh yeah. So there are lots of different reasons that coaches do that, and I don't blame them for it, because again, they're surviving that system as well.
Sure.
But it's just important, for athletes and parents to have that realistic mindset going into this before they're blindsided by it when, their kid is in college.
So let's talk about surviving the second tier. You cast the characters not as track and field athletes, not as tennis athletes, which is my wheelhouse, but as fighters. Am
Mhm.
I under? I mean, I haven't had the chance to read the book yet, which I'm really sad about, but I'm gonna read it because we did this kind of last minute, and the book just came out. But I have read lots of synopses. So, tell us a little bit about why you chose that sport and how you decided to create your characters to best tell the story of surviving the second tier.
Yeah, so the major premise of my novel is that, sometime in the near future, athletic departments eventually outspend themselves. They spend so much on facilities and fancy gear and just unnecessary renovations and things like that to attract recruits. And so, in my novel, these athletic departments eventually go bankrupt. And so the governing body of college sports then has to step in and say, okay, we want to salvage this industry. And so what we are going to do is we are going to downsize the multi-sport model of college sports into a single sport model. And that one sport is fighting. And the reason being for that is that fighting is a cheap sport. It doesn't require a lot of officials or facilities or anything like that. It's just as violent as football, so it's pretty lucrative and glamorous, and people really get into it. It's easy to sell. And the reason I picked fighting for a variety of reasons. I was not a college fighter. Like I said, track and field was my thing. I actually recently started covering women's MMA, but that was well after I wrote my book. But I chose fighting because for several reasons. So first of all, I really do think that we over glamorize the brutality of American football in ways that are very problematic. We know about head trauma, we know about CTE, we have all of this knowledge at our disposal about how football directly contributes to that, and we're still playing and it's still lucrative. And so I kind of took that energy and just ramped it up to 11, and I wanted to get people to think very critically about how we gloss over the very problematic aspects of American football. And also just, the UFC and the MMA fighting industry, the more I learn about it too, the more I see similar problems that college athletes face. And so that was another unintentional critique that I've lumped in there as well. I also chose fighting because it's a metaphor for the ways that college athletes do have to fight each other in certain ways. So I mentioned like scholarship policies and how if you as a college athlete don't do well, that your scholarship is on the line and it can potentially be gifted to a teammate. And so that for me created a lot of really unhealthy dynamics within my team. It caused me to view my teammates as threats. And it really just contributed to a lot of problematic thought processes for me later in my professional life, because I had viewed success as this limited resource. And so when I did that for so long in college, it really bled into my life as a grad student. I would think like, oh, that person got published, so like I'm not doing enough and I need to be better than them. And it's like not everything is a competition. And I'm learning that that it's okay to be happy for people when they succeed, which sounds so basic. But after having to fight my teammates for resources like that for so long, it was just embedded in me to view other people's success as a threat to mine. I also wanted to illustrate how, women and men need to fight each other in these athletic departments for resources, because so many of these resources just automatically go to men's basketball and football as a default, because we have a lot of leaders in the college sports industry that think that those are the only marketable sports. And so there's a lot of fighting for respect. There's a lot of fighting for resources and just general human dignity, especially when you're a female athlete who just doesn't have the same amount of default respect as a male athlete. And so there were multiple reasons why I chose why I chose that as my main sport. It was very fun to write it. I was actually really worried. I was like, I've never been in a ring, so I don't know if I can write the fight scenes well. And people told me like, no, you got in their heads very well, and like it was exciting. So I was like, okay, cool. Like I could, in my brain at least, I could win a fight, I guess. But and then I do write a lot about, the recruiting process, injuries, and just other issues that affect college athletes, because I wanted to use this fictional novel as a vehicle for my research on NCAA policy as a doctoral student. Because I learned through talking to people about policy that not everyone is as enamored with policy as I am. And so I would start talking about policy books with them and their eyes would glaze over. And I thought, okay, I need a better way to package my research to make it more interesting. And so for the longest time, I would tell people, the NCAA is a dystopia. And then they'd be like, oh, okay, why? And then that helped me get into the policy issues that I was so fascinated with and that I was so enamored with. And so it really just became a good bridge to talk about my academic work in more casual context and get people fired up about these issues. So it really all started with a metaphor. I'd never really intended to publish it, but I tell people it was a side project that got out of control, and now it's here and available for people. So I really I hope people learn from it. I hope people start to view college athletes in more human terms after this and see, because it's a very human story. It's not just about the problems in the college sports industry. It's also just about general struggles of college athletes, and also just things that athletes can relate to, like winning a big game or achieving a really big goal or just having good relationships with your teammates that you love and cherish. So I wanted to cover a lot of ground in this book. And it's always just been a lifelong goal for me to write a book. So it's here, it's available, Surviving the Second Tier. And it's TIER like a cake. And it's available on Amazon now, or on all of my social media platforms as well. That link is in the bio. I hate to get like promotional with it,
No, do. And I was just getting ready to say, we'll have all those links in the show notes on parentingaces.com as well. So people will be able to just click and purchase. No worries about that. We always want to help our guests promote their work and get more eyes on it. That's a definite goal here at Parenting Aces. So promote away.
I appreciate that.
Katie, before we close, I wanted to ask you about your freelance work too, because the way that I learned about you was through one of our partners, LRT Sports, which is now rebranded, and I already forgot the new name. It's second. Wait, what is it?
Two-a-days.
Two-a-days.
Mm-hmm.
Two-a-days, because I knew it was something with a two. You do a lot of work with Kirsten and with Two-a-days, and have done podcasts and all sorts of presentations, written tons of articles. Why is that organization something you choose to spend your time with?
Yeah, I am so grateful for Kirsten and so grateful for Two-a-days. It's going to be really hard to get used to saying Two-a-days instead of LRT.
It's LRT Sports for me. I'm so sorry. Kirsten, I apologize. I will do better.
I do the same thing. I'm like, Two-a-days.
Yeah.
But no, I have so much gratitude for her and her company, just because what Two-a-days does and the work that I do, there is a ton of overlap between us. And I love their mission and their goals, because a huge goal of Two-a-days is transparency in the recruiting process and beyond. And so they start off with their coach ratings tool, which college athletes can access and rate their coaches anonymously. So again, it goes back to just like knowing what you're signing up for, because like you mentioned, these recruiting trips, they're essentially highlight reels. They're not going to say like, oh yeah, we have our athletes do Two-a-days every other day, and like, oh yeah, practice is at this end of campus and your building where all of your classes are at this end, and so there are a lot of logistics.
And you have 5 minutes to get between.
Yeah. My so WKU is built on a hill. We're the Hilltoppers. That's our mascot, because our campus is built on a hill. And so I had so many classes at the top of the hill that I did not realize were at the top of the hill, which was always very fun after like morning practice or whatever. But those are just things that people don't really get into. And so not only do we provide the coach ratings tool, but we have freelancers who write about the experiences of college athletes, either through their own lenses as current and former college athletes, or through interviews. And then I write a lot about NCAA policy. So, things like scholarship policies, for example. A lot of athletes don't know that most college scholarships are not full ride scholarships. They'll get what's called an equivalency scholarship, where they're competing for, room and board or meals or tuition, but usually not all of those things combined. And a lot
Nor are they guaranteed for 4 years.
Yeah. And a lot of athletes don't understand too that they're usually renewable scholarships, which means that they expire at the end of whatever term is outlined on your scholarship agreement. And so it's really important for prospective athletes to read those papers, and make sure that they know for sure what they're getting into. And so part of my job as a freelancer is that education. And that's something that I, as a doctoral student who does research and who teaches as well, I am super passionate about that education and that transparency. I stumbled upon two-a-days back when they were LRT Sports, because I was blogging at the time, and my shockingly, my blog on college sports policy was not doing well. And so I promoted it to a Facebook group for parents of college athletes. And I said, hey, like, some of y'all might be interested in this. It's useful information. And then Kirsten was like, we're interested in this. Would you like to write us a story? And I did. And then she took me on as a freelancer. And I'm just so grateful that, that platform allows me to get my work out and to do the education work that I am so passionate about, because it's hard to overstate how important it is for college athletes to educate themselves and to know the industry before they get into it.
Absolutely. All right, Katie, before we close, I want to go back to your book, your novel, Surviving the Second Tier. Again, it's available on Amazon. It's available through your website. We will have all those links on parentingaces.com. If people want to follow you on socials, how do they do that? And we'll have those links in the show notes as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm primarily on Twitter and Instagram. My handle is Lever Fever. It's my last name followed by the word fever, because when I made all of my social media in high school, it was Bieber fever was the big thing. And so we were just like, oh, like all my friends were like, oh, let's do Lever Fever. So that was how that stuck.
I love it. That's a perfect way to end this conversation. Perfect.
Awesome.
Well, thank you again for coming on. I'm so excited for you fulfilling your dream of publishing a novel, and can't wait to read more of your research. Good luck with your PhD. And I know that's just a grueling process, but hey, as a former collegiate athlete, you know how to grind, you know how to persevere through difficulties and roadblocks and all of those things. So I have all the faith in the world that we'll see those letters after your name next time you come on the podcast.
That'd be great. Yeah. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. And to my listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. We'll catch you next time on Parenting Aces.